Hi everyone, welcome to my paper, White Women, Lady Jane's Colonial Afterlife. It was presented at the um, University of Limerick's recent Ghost Studies conference. I think that was in collaboration with Melbourne and another university as well. Um, so Jane Austen's novels and subsequent adaptations are known for their sharp dialogue, memorable characters, and commentaries of early 19th century societal norms focused on white women's love lives and the preoccupation with extreme wealth, marriage, and social standing. The place of colonization, enslavement, and empire is not as popular as one might expect. Edward Said made an intervention um, back in the 90s thinking about Mansfield Park and absentee slave ownership. People who managed plantations and enslaved people, all while from Britain divorced from the terror happening overseas. In 1955, a French philosopher called Guy Debord popularized the term psychogeography to describe the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behaviors of individuals. For those estates that Jane Austen's adaptations take place on as sites of white women's belonging, we might see how certain white womanhoods might take on the trans-historical spirits of white women as slave owners and the nearly 50% who made compensation claims. Black British ghost studies might begin by asking how the spirits of white women as slave owners sits in the heritage sector's haunted past and present. De Boer's work is useful to think about the links between whiteness, gender, and space, and so to write Britain's empire and its profits back into those film sets would be to admit they have my ancestors' blood on it. As a black viewer, when I see these country estates, I see the colonial blood splatter on the walls. How Austen is seen in the media is really a tale of white escapism and certainly stories about white womanhood. White women are everywhere in Austen and nowhere. Concurrently, we have a present reality of vast heritage sites as film sets when those questions of racism have been talked about in a physical sense and the mental sense or psychological sense. But what about the spiritual? What happens when I go to a heritage property and leave feeling wayward about the energies I've experienced? Wealthy aristocrats who could have enslaved my ancestors. I came to think of this feeling as anthropomorphic whiteness to describe what absorbed from objects, castles, parks, gardens, churches, country houses, and from white women on these sites where the building may offer certain kinds of empowerment to those most privileged by them as well. Austen stories cannot have it both ways, women's empowerment or white supremacist fantasy. Ruth Wilson Gilmore offers a way of seeing how the ghosts of enslaved people are pushed out of Austen and really how we see authors like Austen. The UCL's 10-year project, where they digitize the slave compensation records, holds the keys for reading Austen, I guess, in a more anti-racist way, and the ghost stories as stories about Black genocide. It talks about women like Catherine Anderson, who was awarded around £5,000 for the loss of 187 enslaved people. Yet, compared to Emma Woodhouse in Austen's Emma, 5,000 is really a pittance sum. In Emma, she is described as clever, rich, bringing in a personal fortune of £30,000, but we are never told the origins of the Woodhouse fortune. Screen adaptations obscure those facts as well. Um, Historian Hannah Young's PhD looked at the links between gender, property, and power, showing how both women and men played important roles in the transfer of slave based wealth into Britain. One point of her thesis shows the ways women benefited. For characters like Lizzie Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, her stories could be expanded into her marriage into wealth. Other readings may be that her husband Darcy acquired his wealth as an absentee slave owner. Darcy is answerable to his auntie, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who inherited her money and estate from her dead husband, and lives at the picturesque Rosings Park. The de Bourgh fortunes or holdings may be too slave related. As a character, Lady Catherine is a schemer and very savvy at getting what she wants, very comparable to the life of Lady Anne Eliza Bridges. And Bridges is not concerned about loss of life here, but resources and how people living on these estates, as she did in Buckinghamshire, are made ghostly by the fact that they're presented as business people rather than slave owners and enablers of genocide as well. So if you've seen what's not there, you begin to see what is there. In Austen's rural, I see the rural Caribbean and Grenada, where my family are from. At every estate, I dream of ancestors, colonizer and colonized, where my family were also farmers. My great grandmother, Sita, was a farmer, market trader, and never left Grenada, while my other great grandparents, Toyley and Benmark, came to Northampton in 1962. They were village people from Granroy, St. John, while Sita was from a place called Borleo in St. George Parish and came to Granroy when she was 16 in 1927. You'd think, what has Austen possibly got to do with my family members? Absolutely everything. We're taking white women as slave owners, the ancestors of the Ventours and the Noels, were on the other side of that history as well. And go into those estates, their blood splatter is on the walls. Yet rural spaces in Britain are often seen as places of escape. The children that grew up in the rural Caribbean, many were an extra pair of hands to work, but many were also allowed to be children. Siblings Ron Frater and Marcia Walker talked to me about their grandparents. Until she was 6, Marcia lived in a place called Duckenfield with her parents before going to Hampton Court, St. Thomas, Jamaica, to live with her maternal grandparents, Alexander Nesbith and Francesca McDowell. Growing up at Hampton Court, the place she left as a child, was not one of cityscapes and tower blocks, but of countryside. On Wednesday, she helped her grandmother grate coconut. It was on Friday nights. Francesca took the coconut oil to the market in the village and to the market on Saturdays. Alexander was not a black man either, but what they called Assyrian. Ron remembers their grandfather being fair-skinned and having wavy hair. He recounts how the Nesbiths made their money through loan sharking. When poorer people couldn't pay what they owed, they took the equivalent in land. And to be honest, the Nesbith story is very Austen, medieval in its punishment and brutality, except Austen exports that violence overseas to the Caribbean and to the Americas. Alexander Nesbith and his brothers were also involved in the dredging of Gatun Lake in Panama. One of the brothers was reportedly killed in a flood. Through the oral histories of those now dubbed the Windrush generation, there are phantoms of the slave trade. Austen and the stories of many of her contemporaries are perfect sites to track the ghosts and echoes of absentee slave ownership that on heritage sites, their echoes and murmurs continue to live on in the white women as perpetrators of racism. Places that we now call bush in the Caribbean cast a long shadow over Austen's countryside. They place us into the fields of the past and back again. In Austen's world of money and property, there is a phantasmic history of properties produced by my kin as metaphor. For the clitter-clatter of bones, the flicker of a flame or a warm casket, there are midnight meetings and the death of a place's there not there-ness, and shells of memories of an old house. In rural stately homes, as slave properties, there are shadow memories, trauma like a graveyard of teeth, as a history of phantoms where the rural estate mirrors the landscape in the Caribbean, a big house surrounded by plantations, so it's greenwashing. So as black walkers wander, we might hear poltergeists in the basement and phantoms in the fields. The paintings might move. Walking, I don't know if I'm hearing things, but I feel an energy here. I'm back in Grenada, where I saw my family graves. I began to see how my ancestors were helped into those graves by the economics, like those in Austen stories, that boomerang effect of empire. Thinking about Austen like an apparition across time, the lady vanishes. The country house is full of silences, the blood splatter on the walls without a body, and an evidence locker without a crime scene. Sadia Hartman talks about the challenges of finding the human of black people in slave archives that focus on status as property. Could it be analysing white women on these estates we see the non-fiction in Austen's fiction? Hartman contends with the arts, the ways the arts lift spirits, animating the groans and cries of the enslaved from the erasure imposed upon those who wrote history. My family shows up in the records, but I could not find the human, but I found records of accounts. Is Austen and the countryside to some white women what Churchill is to some white men? do these symbols of empower a certain type of belonging, and a white belonging at that, and how those on country estates may be empowered to police others who they feel don't belong there, with white women still acting in that logic of empire that pervaded Austen's Britain. We can argue there are certain geographies that were designed for white womanhood in the same ways there are for white malehood. On the rural country estate today, sociologist Avery Gordon might call these echoes, hints, and suggestions of the past. To be haunted, she puts it, is to be tied to historical and social effects. In England, certainly following the murder of George Floyd, we've had a lot of talk about racism as a physical and a psychological manifestation, but alarmingly little on racism as a spiritual project, where those colonial afterlives scream through the statues, the castles, our institutions, reaching out of the past, ghosts, hauntings. That would be a novel approach, and to open a conversation that cannot be quantified in usual ways of seeing, as we are talking about listening as seeing. Anthropomorphic whiteness then gives a language to the ways in which the terror of colonial history is embedded in present-day objects, haunted by the past. Going to these sites, I walk that trajectory between the human and the non-human world, where the world of white racism and the many shades of violence can speak between the veils of the living and the dead, and what lurks in the dark corners of country estates. In the words of Annie from Ryan Coogler's film Sinners, there are legends of people with the gift of making music so true it can pierce the veil between life and death, conjuring spirits from the past and the future. In ancient Ireland, they were called Fili. In Choctaw land, they were called firekeepers. And West Africa, they were called griots. This gift can bring healing to their communities, but it also attracts evil. But what about when the music goes the other way, where rather than oppressed people rising to the sound of their ancestors, we see oppressors, brazen and proud, dancing to the spirit of their past, violent and unpeaceful. In Heritage, stately homes as white escapism placed to that tune through authors like Austen. The fact whiteness is a structural feature of British society is identifiable through a colonial history that's not over, and its soul-sucking nature moves through spaces, places, institutions, and physical structures, buildings, and Austen's world in stately homes. And Heritage is just one universe of many. Thanks very much. And again, if you like the sort of work I do, you can leave a comment. If you've got questions, leave a comment in the comment section, or send me an email at tradeventour.com/contact.